Welcome back, everybody. We're still on the magazine, The New Nation. This is the third video where we're going to finish the magazine, pages 14 through 17. So go grab your copy if you don't already have it, and open it up to page 14. Here we are. Page 14. War of 1812. More and more settlers have been moving west and claiming lands that belong to your tribe and to other American Indian tribes. Food is getting harder to find, and sometimes the U.S. Army tries to chase your people away. One afternoon, a ripple of excitement runs through your village. You go with your father to hear Chief Tecumseh of the Shawnee people speak. He wants the Indian nations to work together to stop the settlers from encroaching or moving past agreed-upon borders. Tecumseh did convince some tribes to join his efforts. In Canada, they allied with the British, who also wanted to keep the United States from growing. This alliance was one reason the U.S. and Britain began fighting in the War of 1812. So here's a picture of that chief. And let's read about this guy here. Isaac Brock, a British commander in Canada, made alliances with native tribes. The tribes had begun to think the British were their best hope to repel the settlers. American settlers became suspicious of the British. Meanwhile, Canadians felt the Americans were using conflicts with the native people as an excuse to conquer territory. In this photo with the ships. There was another reason for the War of 1812. The British Navy was stopping American ships at sea to keep them from trading with Britain's enemies. Captured American sailors were forced to work on British Navy ships. Forcing people into military service is called impressment. Impressment. It's a new word for me. Top of page 15 here. This flag looks like it says, "Don't give up the ship." The British Navy was a world power, but the young U.S. Navy still won important battles. During the Battle of Lake Erie, U.S. Commander Oliver Hazard Perry famously flew a flag that said, "Don't give up the ship." In the Battle of the Thames, U.S. soldier defeated the British and their native allies. Chief Tecumseh was among those killed. After his death, the partnerships he had built among native groups came to an end. In this photo here, it looks like there's some ships out there. On September 13th, 1814, Francis Scott Key watched the fierce battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. After many hours of fighting, the British retreated and the U.S. flag was raised above the fort. Key was so moved by the experience, he was inspired to write a poem. Later, the Star-Spangled Banner became our national anthem. In this photo here, U.S. General Andrew Jackson drove the British out of New Orleans well after the U.S. had won the war. 2 weeks earlier, on December 24th, 1814, the British and the Americans had signed a peace treaty in Europe. Because news traveled slowly at that time, word of the peace treaty reached New Orleans too late to prevent the battle. And this woman here, Dolly Madison, was married to U.S. President James Madison. She introduced the idea that the First Lady was the symbolic mother of the nation. She hosted the first inaugural ball and helped set the tone for the First Lady's responsibilities. When the British attacked Washington, D.C., Madison risked her own safety to save the portrait of George Washington that hung in the White House. She also saved many important documents. Interesting. It's the War of 1812. Our last 2 pages here, after the war. After the war, signed on December 24th, 1814, the Treaty of Net officially ended the War of 1812. However, it didn't fix the problems that had caused the war. The agreement was made because a long war with France had worn Britain out. Also, American leaders figured not losing was almost as good as fighting to victory. Still, many Americans believed they actually had won. Defeating a powerful European force triggered stronger feelings of nationalism. Nationalism is a sense of loyalty and pride to your country. For the first time, many people felt they were Americans, rather than, say, New Yorkers or Virginians. On the bottom of this page, the period from 1815 to 1825 became known as the Era of Good Feelings. Americans began to have stronger feelings of unity. The phrase was coined by Benjamin Russell in the Boston Federalist newspaper, the Columbian Centennial. So after winning a big wars, people kind of really felt like one nation instead of a bunch of different states. On page 17 here, this image, this looks like a king and some people. The caption reads, "Political strife on the national level was decreasing. There was a sense that everyone shared the same views. This was mostly because one political party, the Democratic Republicans, was on the rise. Meanwhile, the Federalists, who had opposed the war, were in sharp decline." In this photo, a Democratic Republican presidential candidate James Monroe won in a landslide against the Federalist candidate Rufus King. King was the last ever Federalist presidential candidate. Even so, by the time Monroe took office in 1817, the era of good feelings had inspired reconciliation between the two parties. So, joining together again, being friendly again. In this photo, in 1823, President James Monroe spelled out his Monroe Doctrine. It demanded that European powers, such as Britain, Spain, and France, request that the Western Hemisphere was the United States' sphere of interest. The doctrine made clear that the U.S. would tolerate no further European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. So he's kind of saying like, hey, Europe, all the way out here, you're not welcome anymore. All right, my friends, that's the magazine. We started by taking a look at all of the immigrants that chose to move to the United States for various reasons from various countries. Some of the routes they took in order to move further inland, further west on land, and some of the routes they took to move further inland, further west via the water. We learned about some of the pioneers to settle these new territories and new states, the first to settle, the first settlers to settle there since there were indigenous people there. We learned about some of the tall tales in Wisconsin about tall bunyan and lumberjacks. We learned about exploring even further west with the Louisiana Purchase. We learned about the War of 1812, where we fought against Britain and some of the indigenous peoples and ended up sort of winning. It was kind of more of just an end to the war. And the fact that after the war, all of these people in the United States really felt like members of the United States, not just members of an individual state. So I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.